What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. In this video, I am going to showcase some new macros that I have created for World of Warcraft using a mod called GNOME Sequencer Enhanced. This mod allows you to create extremely powerful macros that can perform most, if not all, of your rotation with a single button. This can be extremely useful for individuals like myself who has a disability, or for people who just want to be lazy. So keep in mind that these macros are created primarily for those who are playing the game at a more casual level, but feel free to use them and alter them as you see fit. If you have further questions about the mod or my macros, I recommend checking out my FAQ video, and if you'd like to learn more about how to play the class in question, you might want to check out my crash course. It can help get you started, and I will provide links to all of these things in the description below. Today we're going to check out the macro that I've created for Guardians Druids, and like all tank specs, this one is really straightforward, but it's not as straightforward as other tank specs with the inclusion of Moonfire, which is what kind of made this a little bit more of a challenge. When I came into this, I thought I had it down perfectly, and I thought it was going to be easy, and then I remembered that, of course, you have to cast Moonfire and maintain that as a dot, which, adds a little bit of difficulty when doing macros, as many of you might already know, but I have managed to get everything down into one button. So we're going to type /GS to open up GNOME Sequencer, scroll all the way down, ignoring all of these, and you will find the one that you will be importing, which is called Kef Guardian. Ignore these other experimental ones. Kef Guardian is the one that you want. It is a single target and AoE macro, and with the use of modifiers, I have managed to get all of your rage spending abilities in the macro. So the first thing the macro will do is, if you are not in a form, it will put you in bear form. Excuse me, hiccups. And we go on down, and then holding down Shift, Control, or Alt will use one of your rage spending ability. Shift for Maul for dumping rage on damage. Control on Iron Fur for dumping rage on Iron Fur, and then of course Control or Alt will use Frenzied Regeneration. And so if you're not holding down a modifier, you will not be consuming rage. I thought about just having Maul be the default, so like if you're out questing in the world or whatever, you'll use Maul. You really don't often need to use your mitigation abilities, but the problem with that is that as a Guardian Druid, you don't just want to spend your rage all the time. You want to kind of let it build so that you can spend it appropriately on the abilities that it needs to be spent on. So I felt like this was the best approach. You are free to just remove the modifiers for Maul and then bring Maul down into the main sequence area, and then the macro will use Maul as a, just on normal, and that way, you're not, if you're out questing, you want to be using Maul all the time. You're free to do that if you want to, or you can just hold down Shift and use Maul whenever you have the rage for it. It's entirely up to you how you go about doing this, but I feel like this was the best way to kind of go about it. So under pre-macro, if you, whatever your essence is where I've put this here. In case my case is Concentrated Flame, the macro will use that ability on cooldown. What's cool is, as of now, this wasn't the case at first when I started out on this venture of creating macros for every class and spec, but as of now, if I type in cast Heart Essence, then whatever my Heart Essence is what will become the text here. So if you change your essence out, the macro will switch over to whatever new essence you're using. You will not have to come in here and change it every time now. So all of the abilities or all of the past videos where I've said, you have to change it to whatever your new essence is, or whatever, you're going to have to come in here and change it accordingly. You don't have to do that anymore. So it's kind of nice. So unfortunately, I can't go back and, redo all those videos to tell people that, but it is what it is. So your 8.2 essence for your Heart of Azeroth will go under pre-macro, and it'll use that on cooldown. So if you pick an essence that you don't want to use on cooldown, you might want to come in here and remove it from the macro. Just keep that in mind. So the main line in macros, if you have chosen Pulverize to consume, your stacks of Thrash, then the macro will use that whenever it can. If you don't like that the macro is using it so much, because, usually you want to have 3 stacks before you consume, you consume 2 of them on Pulverize, so you always have 1 stack of Thrash up. This is just going to use Pulverize whenever it can. So as soon as you have 2 stacks, it's going to use it. So it may not be ideal, but it does make things easier. So if you want to have more control over Pulverize, you might want to remove it from the macro. It's entirely up to you how you do it, of course. Next up, we have a cast sequence line. Now this is how I was able to get Moonfire in the macro. It was pretty easy with the cooldown on Mangle. So the macro is going to use Moonfire, and then it's going to switch over to Mangle. It'll do 2 casts of Mangle, and then it will go back to Moonfire. And then, of course, if you switch to a different target, the cast sequence resets, so that way you can dot up multiple targets if you need to. Pretty straightforward. The thing is, of course, I don't like using cast sequence lines because they're not perfect. You will cast Moonfire enough to keep it up pretty much at all times, but you will cast it probably within 4 to 7 seconds before the dot would expire. So with like 4 to 7 seconds remaining on Moonfire, it's not ideal, but it's not too bad, I suppose, because like if you recast Moonfire, then the dot is a little bit longer than it is if you do an initial cast. So that's kind of the reason why that happens. I try to have 3 Mangles, but that just made it so that the Moonfire would fall off a good bit before I would get to reapply it. So this is the best I could do. If you don't like the way this works, you are free to remove this cast sequence line from the macro and use Moonfire on a separate button. That will be a little bit easier, especially if you're trying to dot up multiple targets, because it's a sequence line. It's not always going to hit Moonfire right off the bat, so that's something to consider as well. So you're free to remove the line and then just do a cast Mangle, so that way the macro still uses Mangle on cooldown, and then just manage Moonfire on a separate button. Because I had to use the modifiers on these other abilities, I wasn't able to have a modifier for Moonfire, which would have been a better solution to keep it all in one button. But this also works, and I feel like it works pretty well, especially on a single target. For the most part, it works out pretty well. So you might be using it a little bit more often than you need to, but it does make playing the class easier, and that's what these Gnome Sequencer macros are all about, is making your experience a little bit easier to play. So, of course, then we have Thrash, which it will use on cooldown, and then Swipe when you have nothing else to do. And, what's cool is, if you're out of range, the macro will use Swipe a lot because it's the one ability that you don't have to have a target for. So if you're like, in a battleground and you're trying to like catch a rogue or something like that, just start swiping and you spam the macro, and the macro will use Swipe a bunch. So that's actually kind of cool. And now in the bottom we have Bark Skin. The macro will use that on cooldown when you are in combat. And then over in the bottom right, I've gone ahead and done, if you've chosen the talent, Bristling Fur, the macro will also use that on cooldown. I feel like Bristling Fur had a relatively short cooldown. It's kind of a tanky defensive cooldown, but it will generate some rage. It's easy to kind of use a lot, because it's got such a short cooldown, so I thought it'd be okay to put it in the macro. But of course, if you don't want it in the macro, feel free to remove it from the macro. Now, as for talents, there's only a couple really to go over, because for the most part, these are all passives, right? So this second line, obviously Wild Charge, I didn't include it in the macro. You just, use that on the separate button to charge at your target. And then you've got, this one is all passives, basically. You've got same thing, and these are utility abilities. Again, you have more passives, except for Incarnation, Guardian of Ursoc. This is a tanky long-term cooldown, so I did not include it in the macro because of that. It's something that you should probably manage on a separate button, because it's a defensive cooldown and it has a very long cooldown recharge. So, and then next up we have more passives, and then the last line, Lunar Beam. I thought about including that one in the macro as well, but because it has a long cooldown, it casts it at your location, I felt like it would be better for you to manage that on a separate button. I could include it in the macro, but again, it's just one of those things where if you cast it in the wrong location, then you waste it, and then you have a long recharge. So I just went ahead and decided not to include it in the macro. But you can always include it in the macro. It's very easy. Just type slash cast, brackets, talent, colon, 7/2 brackets, and then Lunar Beam. And that way the macro will only cast it if you've chosen it as a talent. And that's basically everything you need to know about these macros and how they work. Remember, these macros work best when they are spammed. So either press the button as fast as you can, or use a rapid fire button, which is fair game as long as you're the one pressing the button. As powerful as these macros are, they are far from perfect. So, if you want to play the game at a high level and get the most out of your class, I highly recommend that you play the game without these macros. But, if you'd like to get started with Gnome Sequencer Enhanced, you can do so by downloading and installing the mod. A link can be found in the description below. Along with it, you will find paste-bin links for any macros featured in this video. If you'd like to use them, simply click the link and you'll be taken to a raw paste bin of the macro. Select the entire macro, copy, log into the appropriate class, type /gs to open the Gnome Sequencer screen, click on Import, paste the macro into the available space, make sure that Automatically Create Macro Icon is checked, and click Import. You can now drag the icon to your action bar and the macro is ready to be used. If you followed all the steps correctly, the macro should be working fine. If something isn't working, start over and make sure that you follow all the steps correctly. If you are having further issues, I recommend that you check out the mod page or contact the mod's author for more information. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and if you'd like, you can support this channel on Patreon. Links to all of this can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.